In this video, we are going to look at how an attempt to stop drug smugglers ended up kicking off the First Opium War. Hey there and welcome back to the channel. Now, when you think of wars in general, let alone ones that involve large empires, it's pretty common to assume that they were kicked off by some kind of grandiose event or series of events. You know, the sort that are typically brought about by political disputes, territorial claims, or a good old-fashioned assassination. But really, if you go back through history, many conflicts got underway because of much more trivial matters. Take, for example, the start of the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that saw the great powers of Europe fight over territory across 3 continents. That particular war started over the ambiguous colonial claims in North America. And today's video is about another war that started over something rather banal, or perhaps even worse than banal, namely drugs. The war that I'm talking about today is generally known as the First Opium War, though it's sometimes referred to as the Anglo-Chinese War. It was fought between the British Empire and China's ruling dynasty at the time, the Qing Dynasty, and took place between 1839 and 1842. While there were numerous contributing factors that helped kick off the war, such as a long history of European imperialism in Asia and a few minor territorial disputes, the immediate cause was China's attempts to put a stop to the illegal opium trade. Now, while opium might be most well known for being a white powder found on the streets of New York City in the early 1900s, the substance itself comes from the opium poppy plant, which is native to Eurasia. For centuries, people have been tapping the plant as seeds to produce a substance that can be smoked or ingested to induce a euphoric high. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Chinese were not the only ones who used opium, but they did make extensive use of it, despite its highly addictive nature. Meanwhile, the British East India Company had been smuggling opium from their holdings in India into China in order to balance out their trade interests with the country. See, China didn't want to trade silver for the sorts of things they produced domestically, like tea and silk. So the British had to smuggle an opium to sell in order to get the silver they needed to pay for said goods. This practice caused massive social disruption in China because of the sheer number of people who became addicted to the drug. The Chinese government considered putting an end to the opium trade and subsequent smuggling a top priority. As the years wore on, the Chinese government attempted to crack down on opium smugglers and, by extension, the British who employed them. But the problem of getting the British to stop smuggling opium into their country wasn't easily solved, mostly because of just how profitable the trade was. In 1839, the Chinese government gave foreigners involved in the opium trade one last chance to stop what they were doing. Otherwise, they would seize all opium found in the hands of non-Chinese people. Lo and behold, the Chinese authorities found a whole lot of opium. As a result, they seized it and then detained many of the British and Indian nationals who possessed it. This action was taken just 2 months after Zexu, the Chinese official responsible for suppressing opium, assumed his post in Canton. Canton was one of the main trading ports between China and the West. Its treaty port status meant that it was open to foreign merchants. However, the Chinese government only allowed them to do business within a small area known as the Factory District. There, merchants lived in compounds that were built around their respective flags or nations. Most of these were located in the southern part of the city. There were also areas for Chinese merchants and warehouses where goods could be stored before being shipped out to sea. While Lin Zibo's actions may seem draconian by today's standards, it was really just the culmination of several years of increasing tensions between China and the British over the opium trade. With the seizure of opium in Canton, the already poor relations between the two countries quickly deteriorated. On November 1839, Lin Zexu gave the foreigners in Canton an ultimatum. They could either forfeit their lives by committing suicide or be banished from China with no possessions except the clothes on their backs. Unsurprisingly, almost all of the foreigners in Canton chose the latter option. Soon after, Lin Zexu ordered the confiscation of any remaining opium in the factories. On December 1839, he ordered that the confiscated opium be destroyed. On the evening of December, the destruction of the opium began. Hundreds of chests were opened and dumped into the sea shower. Over 20,000 chests of opium were destroyed in total, worth approximately £2 million British pounds in today's money. The burning of the opium continued until January 1840. After the task was finished, the Chinese commissioner announced to the remaining foreigners that those who wished to leave China without being searched or having their property confiscated should do so within 3 days. As the foreigners packed up and left Canton, Zexu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria outlining the destructive and addictive effects of opium, declaring that if Britain did not halt its opium exports to China, he would confiscate every ounce of British goods in China and expel all British subjects from the country. Clearly, things had reached a breaking point. The British responded to Zexu's ultimatum by closing the port of Canton and detaining several Chinese sailors who had come aboard British ships in port. Tensions continued to rise, and soon the Chinese began to attack British shops and warehouses outside the factory district. With hostilities rapidly rising, the British and Chinese prepared for war. Soon after the start of hostilities, British troops captured the city of Xiamen. It was followed shortly by the capture of Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai. As the Chinese fell back, they burned their own villages and farmland, hoping to deny the advancing British forces food and supplies. Zexu fled inland, and the retreating Chinese army looted and pillaged along the way, killing many Chinese civilians. By mid-1840, half of Shanghai was in ruins. By this point, the British had taken control of several key ports along the coast. But controlling these cities was proving difficult. The British also realized that the size of their force was woefully inadequate for the task. At the time, the British only had 3,000 troops in China, though reinforcements were on the way. One of the reasons why the British were initially so successful was because of the introduction of modern naval weaponry. The British Navy enjoyed the advantages of superior technology, including steam-powered vessels and cannons that shot further and more accurately. The British bombardment of Fort Arthur near Shanghai is a good example of the technological gap between the two navies. After firing nearly 3,000 rounds over a period of 4 days, the Chinese lost 270 men killed and 688 wounded. In contrast, the British suffered no casualties. Meanwhile, the British and Chinese armies clashed in numerous battles, most notably the Battle of Changsha in April 1840. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly clear to the British that winning a decisive victory in the field would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Instead, the British decided to adopt a strategy of gradually tightening the blockade on Chinese ports. Their plan was that eventually the Chinese government would come to the negotiating table. Finally, in 1842, the British captured the Chinese city of Nanjing. Once again, the Chinese leadership had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed on August 29, 1842. Among its many provisions were terms that opened up additional Chinese ports to foreign traders and gave British citizens special trading privileges throughout China. Furthermore, the treaty forced the Chinese to pay an indemnity of $21 million to compensate for the loss of life and property during the conflict. To make matters worse for China, the British captured Hong Kong and ceded it to the Crown. The First Opium War was over. While the First Opium War was officially between China and the British, the conflict really involved two very different Chinas. One was the coastal trading centers, which were accustomed to dealing with foreigners and were relatively open to the idea of Western ideas. The other was the interior of the country, where the vast majority of the population lived. Traditional values and beliefs were still the norm here. The defeat in the First Opium War was a real shock to many in China, and it made many suspicious of foreigners and their ideas. Ironically, the war led to a resurgence of traditional values in China, which helped lead to the end of the Qing Dynasty and the beginning of the Republic of China in 1912. But that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. The year is 1856. You are about to witness the most humiliating defeat ever suffered by a great power. In 1839, Chinese official Zexu confiscated over 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants in Guangzhou, also known as Canton. He then publicly destroyed them. Now that's not something you see every day. But this event was merely the latest in a series of incidents that had been escalating tensions between the Chinese and the British for years. You may be asking yourself why the Chinese were destroying foreign property. And the answer to that is a word that rhymes with quack. Opium was illegal in China. But since the 1700s, Chinese officials had turned a blind eye to the trade because it brought in much-needed silver into the country and because they themselves were getting rich from the profits. However, the amount of opium being imported into China was becoming more and more excessive, and the Chinese government was starting to feel the social consequences of this uncontrolled drug epidemic. As the number of smokers grew, so did the number of beggars and prostitutes. Crime rates increased and people became too addicted to work, causing the economy to slow down. So in 1839, the Chinese government decided to crack down on opium. They ordered all foreign merchants to turn over their stock of the drug or face severe punishment. When the British merchants refused, the Chinese seized their opium and burned it. Now, while the destruction of property is bad enough, what really got the British riled up was the insult to their nation's honor. If the Chinese wanted to seize opium, they should have just taken it and given the merchants compensation. But instead, they chose to destroy the opium and humiliated the British by doing so. A British newspaper called it the greatest act of hostility that has been committed by the Chinese government towards the British subjects since the commencement of our intercourse with that country. A few months later, another incident occurred which heightened tensions even further. In March 1839, a group of British sailors were traveling from Hong Kong to Guangzhou when one of them shot and killed a Chinese villager. The Chinese authorities tried the sailor in a Chinese court, but the British government refused to allow him to be punished. Instead, they took the sailor back onto their ship and let him go without any charges being filed. The Chinese were furious. They saw this as a double insult, first having their legal authority rejected and second, the killer go in and punished. As a result, the Chinese began searching British ships whenever they docked in Chinese ports for any illegal goods. They also banned all British ships from entering unless they received permission beforehand. This caused huge delays for the British merchants and was seen as an infringement upon their rights to free trade. So in June, the British sent a delegation to Beijing to file a complaint with the Chinese government. They argued that they should be allowed to import opium duty-free, that they should have the right to travel throughout China without interference, and that they should receive the same treatment as the Russians and Americans, who were exempt from many of the laws that applied to the British. But the Chinese government rejected these demands. They continued to harass British ships looking for illegal goods. And this eventually led to open warfare. In December 1856, a group of Chinese officials boarded a U.S. ship and arrested two American missionaries for distributing Bibles in China. The Chinese then took the missionaries to a local jail. So the Americans sent a delegation to the Chinese government demanding the missionaries be released. But while the Americans were negotiating with the Chinese, a group of British sailors landed in the city to show support. The Chinese, believing that the British were there to cause trouble, seized several British citizens and put them in jail. The British responded by sending a military force to occupy a nearby island. Then they began attacking Chinese coastal towns. Within a week, 40,000 Chinese soldiers had arrived to defend their country. And on December 26, 1856, the First Opium War began. This war would last for 6 years and be one of the first times that Western military force was used to subjugate an Asian nation. At the time, China had one of the largest standing armies in the world, with some estimates putting its size at over 500,000 men. However, the Chinese army was no match for the British. While the Chinese had more soldiers, the British were better trained and equipped. The British East India Company supplied their soldiers with the latest rifles, artillery and warships. Plus, the British were determined to win the war. On the other hand, the Chinese were fighting to defend their national honor. They believed that Western imperialism was a threat to the Middle Kingdom and that the Chinese people had a duty to resist. But despite their best efforts, the Chinese lost. By 1860, the British had captured several key cities in China. They had taken Shanghai, the Yangtze River estuary, Lake Taihu, Lake Chaohu, the city of Hangzhou, and the Summer Palace in Beijing. Meanwhile, the Chinese had only managed to capture one British-held territory, the city of Aden. Seeing that they were losing badly, the Chinese sued for peace. In October 1860, representatives from both sides met together in Beijing to discuss peace terms. The Chinese asked for the British to withdraw from Chinese territory and for the release of any captured Chinese citizens. In return, they offered to give the British 21 million silver dollars as compensation for the opium they had seized. However, the British weren't satisfied with this deal. They wanted more. First, they demanded that the Chinese pay them 21 million silver dollars as an apology for the indignities their citizens had suffered. Second, they demanded that the Chinese grant them full diplomatic recognition. And third, they demanded that the Chinese allow Christian missionaries to travel throughout the country. The Chinese rejected these demands, and the negotiations broke down. So the British invaded again. The second invasion was even more devastating than the first. With the help of Indian soldiers from the East India Company, the British advanced on Beijing. On October 6, 1860, they entered the city and began pillaging. Thousands of Chinese civilians were killed and countless others were injured. After burning down the old summer palace, the British withdrew. But this time the Chinese couldn't stop them. On November 24, 1860, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed. This treaty was extremely humiliating for the Chinese. They had to pay the British 21 million silver dollars. They had to recognize the British Emperor as the Emperor of China. And they had to allow Christian missionaries to travel freely throughout the country. The British also gained access to several Chinese ports, including the city of Guangzhou. As for the opium trade, it was now legal in China. In the end, the Chinese lost everything. Their prestige was ruined, their treasure was gone, and their country was now wide open to Western influence. The question is, how did this happen? Why did the Chinese lose such a devastating war? There are many answers to this question. Some historians blame the Chinese government for being corrupt and incompetent. Others blame the British for being too strong. But the truth is both sides played a role in China's defeat. The Chinese government was indeed corrupt. Its officials were more concerned with collecting taxes than with defending the country. Also, the Qing government didn't believe that the British were capable of winning a war against them. They knew the British had a small army and relied mainly on their navy for defense. The Chinese thought their massive army would easily defeat the British and that the real challenge would be subduing the numerous rebel groups that existed in China. However, the British proved to be much stronger than the Chinese expected. Not only did they have a well-trained and disciplined army, but they also had the backing of the entire British Empire. This meant that reinforcements and supplies could arrive in China quickly if needed. Furthermore, the Chinese underestimated the British desire to win the war. They thought the British would get tired of fighting after a while and go home. But this never happened. The British were determined to defeat the Chinese, and they wouldn't accept anything less than victory. The Chinese government's incompetence also played a role in their defeat. Despite being warned about the British buildup of troops, the Chinese didn't take any action to prepare for war. When the British attacked, the Chinese were caught off guard. Also, the Chinese didn't have a good understanding of Western military tactics. They were used to fighting other Asian armies, which relied heavily on infantry and cavalry. However, the British army was mainly composed of riflemen who shot at the enemy from a distance. This was a tactic the Chinese were not familiar with, and they often lost many men before they realized what was happening. However, we should not blame the Chinese alone for their defeat. The British were also responsible for some of the problems that arose during the war. For example, the British were partly to blame for the start of the conflict. Yes, the Chinese were the ones who cracked down on opium. But the British were the ones who refused to compensate the Chinese merchants for the opium that was confiscated. Also, the British could have avoided the war if they had just respected Chinese law. Instead of rescuing the missionary who was under arrest, the British could have paid the Chinese government a fine and he would have been released. But the British didn't want to do this. They felt that it would set a bad precedent. By paying the fine, it would look like the British were admitting that they were wrong, which they refused to do. In the end, the First Opium War was a disaster for China. It weakened their government, enriched Western powers, and opened their doors to Western influence. And fortunately, this would not be the last time that China would be humiliated. In the early 1900s, another Western power would attempt to subjugate China. To find out more about this event, stay tuned. The First Anglo-Chinese War is often remembered as one of the first modern wars in history. It marked the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty, and it also introduced the world to one of the most badass ships ever built. But what really happened during this conflict? How did the Chinese lose so decisively against the British? And why does the US still owe China $26 million over this war? You're about to find out. All the way back in 1840, hostilities broke out between the Chinese and the British. For the longest time, the Chinese had been winning. That all changed when 3 British warships entered the Pearl River estuary near Hong Kong, where they encountered 5 Chinese junks. Even though the Chinese ships were double the size of the British vessels, they weren't able to do anything against them. After being bombarded by cannons, the Chinese retreated to the safety of their larger ships. However, that proved to be a fatal mistake because the British ships were equipped with something called a mortar, which could easily destroy the Chinese ships despite their larger size. Within minutes, all 5 Chinese vessels were destroyed. This battle became known as the Battle of Chunbi, and it was the turning point of the entire war. As the conflict continued, the Chinese realized that they simply couldn't win against the British warships. Because of this, they decided to focus on defending their land instead. The British started off by sending troops to attack the city of Canton, which was the largest port city in China at the time. They wanted to capture the city in order to force the Chinese government to move the war somewhere else. In fact, the British had 4 main goals for the war. These included destroying the Chinese opium trade, opening up new trading opportunities in China, regaining control of Hong Kong, and inflicting heavy losses on the Chinese government to compensate for the opium trade. The British also hoped that their victory would help to boost their economy. Back in Europe, the Industrial Revolution was causing an economic crisis, and they needed some place to sell their extra goods. Britain had tried everything they could to get the Chinese to allow them to establish trading posts in the country, but the Chinese government refused until now. By December 1840, Canton had fallen into British hands. However, the Chinese soon began reassembling their navy in order to fight back. And fortunately for them, they didn't stand a chance. The British had developed a new type of ship that wasn't like anything the Chinese had ever seen before. It was called a paddle steamer, and it was much faster than traditional sailing ships. Plus, they could carry more cargo and withstand much bigger waves. But that wasn't the only advantage they had. The British ships also had better weapons, including swivel guns, howitzers, mortars, and rockets. By comparison, the Chinese ships were slow, inefficient, and outdated. Not only that, but the Chinese were also using old-fashioned black powder, while the British had invented a new type of gunpowder that was much more powerful. So you can imagine what happened when the British attacked Canton again. In just one day, they destroyed 173 Chinese ships and killed or wounded 5,000 soldiers. The rest of the Chinese fleet retreated behind the city walls. So the British decided to bombard the city until it fell. On January 1841, the British captured Canton once again and burned it to the ground. The Chinese simply couldn't fight back. In an attempt to save face, the Chinese government tried to rally the people living along the coast to fight against the invaders. However, many of these people were fishermen who had no interest in going to war. The few brave warriors who did try to defend their homeland were easily defeated by the British. Despite having large numbers on their side, the Chinese army suffered massive casualties due to the introduction of Western weapons such as the spear gun and the revolver. The Chinese government was eventually forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which gave the British everything they had asked for. However, the Chinese probably wouldn't have agreed if they had known that this treaty would be a prelude to the humiliating Treaty of Nanjing. After signing the Treaty of Nanking, the British moved further north in an attempt to capture the Chinese capital of Beijing. Along the way, they stopped at the city of Ningpo. This battle was significant because it showed the true power of the British Navy. Before the British arrived, Ningpo had been defended by a formidable wall that was 60 feet high and surrounded by a deep moat. However, these defenses were no match for the British warships. They simply sailed their ships right up to the shore and opened fire. Their advanced weaponry made quick work of the Chinese soldiers, and within 2 hours, the British had taken over the city. With each passing day, more and more Chinese cities were falling into British hands. So the Chinese government sent out peace negotiations. However, the British rejected them unless the Chinese agreed to let them pass through their country. To make matters worse, the British weren't willing to lower their demands, even after learning that the Chinese emperor was gravely ill. So the fighting continued. Soon enough, the British captured Shanghai and then Hangzhou. From there, they set their sights on the city of Suzhou, which was yet another important trading hub in China. The British took Suzhou without much effort, but the commander of the British forces wanted to teach the Chinese another lesson. His name was Charles Elliot, and he was determined to show the Chinese the superiority of Western weapons. He stationed his men around the city and waited for the Chinese to make their move. Sure enough, the Chinese attacked, but they were no match for the British. Elliot's men shot down hundreds of Chinese soldiers, killing more than twice as many as they lost. Once again, the Chinese were forced to retreat behind their city walls and wait for another day. Elliot decided to lay siege to the city. He ordered his men to build trenches around it and then use artillery to bombard the city. Every day, he fired 100 cannons at Suzhou, killing hundreds of civilians and soldiers. Eventually, the Chinese ran out of food and were forced to surrender. By this point, the Chinese government was desperate for peace. They knew that they simply couldn't win against the British, so they were willing to accept whatever terms they were given. However, the British weren't willing to show mercy. They kept marching forward, taking city after city until they reached Nanjing, which was the capital of China. Elliot once again laid siege to the city, bombarding it with his cannons and cutting off its food supply. The situation became so dire that people were forced to abandon their homes and flee into the countryside. However, when they got there, they were met with even more terrible conditions. Many of them died from starvation and disease. When the British eventually entered Nanjing, they were shocked at the level of destruction they had caused. At this point, the Chinese government was begging for mercy. They were willing to give the British everything they wanted, so long as they would stop attacking. The British commander met with the Chinese officials and demanded that they hand over all Chinese forts west of the Yangtze River, open up for more ports to foreign trade, allow foreigners to travel freely throughout China, impose a tariff on all goods shipped through Chinese waters, and pay Britain $21 million silver to cover the cost of the war. The Chinese agreed to all of these terms, except for one. The British commander had also demanded that they give up Hong Kong, which the Chinese refused. Eventually, the two sides agreed to split the difference and the British accepted Hong Kong Island instead. On August 29, 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was officially signed. The treaty was very favorable to the British and it marked the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty. Soon enough, other Western powers would begin exploiting China as well. Today, most people forget that the First Sino-British War even happened. But it was a very important event in history that helped to shape the world we live in today. Now it's time to make your voice heard. Which side do you think would have won if the war had lasted longer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now go ahead and watch another video.